Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Entry Level Esports. My name is Trent, and as always, I will be taking your Qs and transforming them into As. This week, we have a question from @Eminercy on Twitter. What do you think will attract more new orgs to the game, along with the big esports names that dropped or never invested in the first place? And this is a really interesting question to me. And since we're going to be talking about big major esports organizations, I wore my Immortals jersey. This is for one of their Smash Brothers players that I'm a big fan of. And I wanted to wear it today since we're going to be talking about S-tier organizations, big high-profile esports organizations, and what games they want to invest in and what games they don't want to invest in. And to start that, we're going to come back to the actual question that was asked, but in order to answer that question, I want to ask a slightly different version of that question, which is Heroes of the Storm a game worth investing in for S-tier organizations? When we talk about S-tier organizations, we're talking about the biggest and most prolific esports organizations, the teams that are in League of Legends, Dota, Counter-Strike, that have really high-profile teams that not only have a ton of social media presence and Twitch followers, but win pretty much everything that they're in. They get a ton of prize money, all that sort of thing. They have high-profile investors. Those are what we're talking about when we're talking about S-tier organizations. And so what I want to do first is look at the rosters of a couple of teams that have never invested in Heroes of the Storm, and also a couple of teams that invested in Heroes of the Storm at the beginning, and what games that they're in now, having not ever come back to Heroes of the Storm after they left, and see if we can pull anything from looking at those teams to get a feel for what an S-tier organization is interested in, and how that might help us learn what they might be interested in Heroes of the Storm, or help us determine if it's worth S-tier organizations investing into Heroes of the Storm at all. So the first team we want to look at is Team Solo Mid. For those in the Heroes of the Storm community that might not know, Team Solo Mid is one of the first North American League of Legends teams. They are far and away one of the most popular esports brands in the entire world. Their North American following is huge. They have fans all over the world. They are one of the most successful teams in North America. They win constantly in North America. They struggle internationally, but that really doesn't affect how powerful their brand is in North America. And right now, TSM has teams that are active and competing in League of Legends, Super Smash Bros. Melee and Smash 4, Vainglory, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and they also have some streamers in a variety of games that they have under their brand that aren't actively competing in esports, but that carry the TSM banner, stream under the TSM channel teams, and rep TSM swag and gear and sponsors and that sort of thing. The other team that I want to look at that is a similar big name in North American League of Legends is CounterLogic Gaming. For a time, CounterLogic Gaming was investing in a wide array of games, and they've sort of streamlined their investment down to a handful, where right now they have League of Legends, Super Smash Bros. Melee and Smash 4, and an H1Z1 team. And they just released their competitive professional Counter-Strike team, but they still have an all-female CSGO team. And then they also, like TSM, sponsor a variety of streamers in a wide range of games, including things like Battle.Right. So they even have some obscure games, but they don't have any presence in Heroes of the Storm. So those are two teams that we've never seen invest in Heroes of the Storm. Now I want to look at three teams that originally had teams in Heroes of the Storm and were relatively high-profile teams, but at some point have left the scene and have not come back, and according to my contacts and my research, have no intentions or are even exploring coming back to Heroes of the Storm. It may be that some back-channel conversations have happened with teams that I'm unaware of, but to my knowledge, these teams are not interested in returning to Heroes of the Storm. So the first one I want to look at is Virtus Pro. Virtus Pro was kind of a mid-tier Heroes of the Storm team. They never were one of the best teams in Europe, like Dignitas, Fnatic, and Na'Vi at their time. But they were pretty active. They had a good roster, and they left when their team disbanded, and right now they are in Dota 2, Counter-Strike. They have some Hearthstone players. They have a presence in Quake Champions, and they have a team in Paladins. And I want to really quickly talk about Paladins because I think it's going to help reveal a little bit about how these esports organizations make some of their investment decisions. Paladins is a much smaller game than Heroes of the Storm. It's from a less stable developer. There's really nothing about Paladins that would make a team more interested in investing in it than in Heroes of the Storm, especially a team that already has some history in Heroes of the Storm. You know, players, fans that are longtime fans would be really excited to see Virtus Pro come back to Heroes of the Storm, but they haven't expressed any interest in it, and they have invested in a Paladins team and are paying them a substantial salary to compete in a very minor first-person shooter. And the reason for that is Virtus Pro and a number of other teams like Fnatic, like Renegades, are all part of what's called the WESA, which is the World Esports Association. It's a conglomerate of teams that have all gotten together to try and create a more established presence in esports for their mutual game. And the WESA partnered with HotS to create a professional league for Paladins where every member of the WESA has a team in Paladins. So it's this unique partnership between HotS and Facebook and the WESA to create live streaming content for Paladins as sort of a proof of concept for a WESA league in a game. And so that's the reason that these high-profile brands are in a small game like Paladins, because it's creating a mutually beneficial relationship between them and the developer that's going to help them create more profitable partnerships in the future. They can go to bigger developers and bigger games using the proof of concept that they have from Paladins. So that's one of the reasons that an organization would enter a smaller game, is if there's some kind of benefit to it. And we'll actually use that to talk about Vainglory here in a minute. And Navi, Natus Vincere, is in a very similar boat. They were actually a pretty competitive Heroes of the Storm team in Europe, but have since left the game pretty early on, have no interest in coming back. They are very active and successful in Dota 2, CSGO. They have a Paladins team. They have some presence in Quake Champions. And they also have a FIFA 18 player. And some of you may not be aware, but FIFA is actually one of the biggest games for tournament play, for esports, for streaming that exists out there. It dwarfs every other sports game by a wide margin. And so it actually makes perfect sense for a EU-based organization to be in a game like FIFA. And FIFA is a pretty cheap game to sponsor a player in because you only have to sponsor one player as opposed to a team of 5 like you would in Heroes of the Storm. The last team I want to look at is the most famous team that has left and not returned, Cloud9. I think a lot of people have been kind of hopeful that Cloud9 would someday return. I don't think it's going to happen ever. I would love to be wrong about that. But right now, Cloud9 is actually invested in more games than any other team that I researched. They are in League of Legends, Counter-Strike, Super Smash Bros., both Melee and Smash 4. They have some Hearthstone streamers. They have a pretty popular Rocket League team. They have a team in the Vainglory League. They have a PlayerUnknown Battleground team. And they also have one of the 12 slots in the Overwatch League. They have the London team. So they have cast a pretty wide net, not nearly as wide as it used to be, but they still have some pretty active teams that are all very successful, but they still have not touched Heroes of the Storm. And the Overwatch League, I think, is a big reason why. I think it's also a reason why we won't see teams like Envious, like Optic, like Immortals ever join Heroes of the Storm, because they already have a partnership with Blizzard that's even more high profile and beneficial to them than Heroes of the Storm. It's more profitable for them potentially. And right now, they've invested a ton of their resources into the Overwatch League. So I think we'll see a lot of teams that got spots in the Overwatch League back off of their investment in other games. And just to quickly counteract a comment that might come up, KSV does have the team in Seoul in Korea for the Overwatch League, and they also invested in Heroes of the Storm. But KSV is not a traditional esports organization. They're kind of getting into esports more actively through Overwatch, and as a result of that, getting more teams to build their portfolio as an esports organization. They signed the best Heroes of the Storm team in MVP Black, and they also signed the world champions of League of Legends. So they're getting more aggressive about building an esports foundation that's not solely reliant on the Overwatch League in case the Overwatch League fails. So we're probably going to see them invest in a couple of other things because they don't have existing investments in esports like these other organizations do that are part of the Overwatch League. So looking at those teams, what we see is that about 5 years ago, when these teams got really, really active, right around the time that League of Legends really took off with the LCS and with all these teams sort of forming and becoming very successful off of the back of their investment in League of Legends, we're starting to see they cast a really wide net. So they sponsored every team they could possibly find. TSM used to have a Smite team. They had a Dota team. There were a number of games that these teams were invested in. And what we've seen is that now these teams are really pulling back into the things that are most profitable for them. And I think there's two reasons for this. First, a lot of these teams were run by people that had never run an organization before. Team Solomid was started by a League of Legends player who was not a businessman before he ran TSM. Same thing with Counterlogic Gaming. Cloud9 was started by one of the guys that actually worked for Team Solomid and branched off and started Cloud9. Navi was not the team that it is today before their huge success in Dota. Virtus Pro really took off in Counter-Strike. So all of these teams have seen some success in a game that wasn't massive at one point and became huge, and their team became super successful in that game. And so they're trying to recreate that in other games. And it makes sense when you're early in that phase, especially when esports is younger, to cast a wide net. Smite makes perfect sense. It's League of Legends, but from a third-person perspective with a really interesting IP. There was a ton of potential for Smite to be huge, and Hi-Rez was very interested in the East and teams to invest in that. Same thing with Dota. Team Solomid had a ton of success in League of Legends. If they could also have a successful Dota team, they would be a billion-dollar company. So it made sense for them to invest in a number of games. Cloud9, same thing. They were hugely successful as a unknown team that rose through the ranks in League of Legends and became a hugely profitable company. They wanted to try and recreate that in Heroes of the Storm, and they were successful in getting wins, but the scene hadn't developed to the point that it had when they got into League of Legends, and so they didn't see that return on investment as quickly as they had seen it in other games. And so I think what we've seen is, rather than teams trying to invest in replicating their success in their original game, we're seeing them diversify into unique games that are all relatively stable, that all have different markets to draw from. If you look back at all of the teams we just discussed, they all have one MOBA that they're a part of. They have one fighting game that they're a part of, potentially. They have Rocket League that is very distinct. They have basically just one of each of these games, with the exception of the teams that have a Paladins team by obligation because of their partnership with the WESA. And the other part that is unique is that Cloud9 and TSM have Vainglory teams, and Vainglory is technically a MOBA. So in our diversifying theory, it would make sense for teams that have a League of Legends team to not have a Vainglory team. But Vainglory is a very particularly interesting thing because it's a MOBA that's on phones, and there isn't a huge esports scene for any game that's strictly on your phone right now. So it's a really interesting long-term play for these teams because Vainglory, the guys that make Vainglory, are very interested in cultivating their esports scene. And Vainglory is actually doing pretty well as a title on phones. So there's a lot of potential for down the road Cloud9 and TSM to enter a brand new huge market with Vainglory and with phone-based esports, and they can learn a lot of things from Vainglory when they have a friendly relationship with the developers that could serve them if competitive gaming does take that direction in the future. So that's why these teams are willing to invest in Vainglory, even though they already have MOBA teams in League of Legends. And as a result of that diversification theory, all of these teams have teams either in Dota or League of Legends, and both of those games eclipse HotS in every way. You know, HotS was late to the MOBA party, and as a result is just never going to be as big as League of Legends or Dota, and there's really no reason for Heroes of the Storm to try to compete with those games because very few games can. You know, most games can't touch League of Legends or Dota, even if they're extremely successful, hugely popular games. So if teams are only interested in investing in one MOBA, it's going to be League of Legends or Dota if they can get a successful team that turns a profit there. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the goal of these organizations is to make money. It has to be. Otherwise, they can't keep paying players. They can't keep their staff intact. They can't hire social media coordinators and get brand deals if they don't have capital to provide those resources for the players. There's just no point in them existing. So if they need to diversify and they can get teams in more popular games, they're going to. They're going to go into Dota, they're going to go into League of Legends, and they're not going to look at Heroes of the Storm as a game to invest in because it doesn't fit their diversification portfolio anymore. So based on that, for a wide range of S-tier organizations, ultimately Heroes of the Storm is just not a great investment for those top-shelf organizations right now. It's never going to be the biggest MOBA, and if they need to diversify into other games to tap into different markets and to use different marketing strategies and get different brands on board, the only way to do that is to diversify their portfolio into other games that are in other genres. And so Heroes of the Storm just doesn't make sense for them. So as a result of that, to go back to that original question about how do we get new organizations into Heroes of the Storm, I think there's two solutions that the unsponsored teams want to look at when they're trying to find organizations, or the teams that have organizations that may eventually pull out of Heroes of the Storm, how those teams attract new organizations that can join the Heroes of the Storm esports scene. And I think there's two options that we have there. One route is to have smaller organizations enter the scene at this young stage and grow alongside HotS. So we've got teams like Space Station Gaming, Freedom, Expert. These were not household names. I follow a ton of esports, and none of those names were known to me before they got Heroes of the Storm teams. And now they've got lots of fans. People are buying their jerseys. They're getting more high-profile players onto their organizations, and their players are becoming stars within the scene. Space Station has Jay Shrita now, who I'm calling it early is going to be a huge star in North American Heroes. I think he's going to catapult Space Station into a more high-profile position. Expert came out of nowhere and is now a huge staple in the EU scene. They're building tradition. They're building stars within their roster. So I think these organizations can get in on the ground floor with a slightly weaker team and use their social media presence, use the upheaval within the scene to potentially cause upsets to get them into the top of the scene. If you think about it, Freedom should have been a 6th or 7th place team, but because of the struggles with the top teams in Gale Force and Tempo Storm last season, Team Freedom had the door open for them to suddenly rise up to a place where people have Team Freedom as their favorite team and are buying their jerseys, and they got grandfathered into the ownership rules because they suddenly became such a high-profile team. So if these teams, if these younger organizations have enough capital to make an attractive offer and can play the long game in Heroes of the Storm, I think it can be really beneficial for them and mutually beneficial for the players, because the players can negotiate a little bit more control with these smaller organizations because the smaller organizations need that Heroes of the Storm clout. And then as they grow, they'll have more resources and they'll have more power and they'll have more ability to be more beneficial to that Heroes of the Storm team. The other route that I think is honestly more interesting from the player side for players that are interested in courting sponsors is to go directly to brands and look for a partnership deal. Similar to how Team Wish was with Zealots, how Roll20 is with the guys that were formerly Team 8, what Heroes Hearth has with their team. These are not esports organizations that are looking to build all of their revenue off of traditional esports revenue generation means. They already have a revenue generating model in a product that they provide. Team Wish had their website that Team Wish was essentially advertising for. Roll20 is a platform for playing Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop games that now has more awareness with a huge range of players that follow Heroes of the Storm that are now aware of Roll20 as a platform and are getting more interested in playing tabletop games. And Heroes Hearth is trying to be the #1 source for community-generated content and educational content within Heroes of the Storm. And now their brand is being represented by one of the 8 teams in the league. And so that's going to quickly become the one-stop main place that you go outside of Reddit to get Heroes of the Storm content, because you're just going to have that name constantly in your head. We've also seen this happen in some other games. In Super Smash Bros. Melee, there's a player named Wizrobe who's sponsored by Fry's Electronics, which is an electronics store typically on the West Coast in North America. And a lot of people are becoming more aware of the Fry's brand because of him and building a better connection to that brand because they love Wizrobe, and so they're going to go shop at Fry's. I think there's a lot of opportunity within Heroes of the Storm for these teams that don't have sponsors yet to show that they are better streamers, better social media gurus, and have a following as influencers to sell that to a brand, a Razer, an Alienware, something like that, where we can use the fighting game model where these brands will just slap their logo on a jersey and have that name be brought up constantly throughout a tournament and get a ton of clout with the players in that community, as well as getting the brand recognition. Because there's not a ton of esports organizations established in Heroes of the Storm yet, there's an opportunity for brands to get in on the ground floor and become a household name within a game that's growing like Heroes of the Storm, that has enough capital behind it from Blizzard to know that it's not going to close its doors suddenly. A brand can have a 2 to 3 year plan within Heroes of the Storm and reasonably expect a return on investment, because it's unlikely that Blizzard is going to close down Heroes of the Storm within the next 5 years unless things go catastrophically wrong, and it's unlikely that they'll do so because Blizzard has all of these other avenues to get players into Heroes of the Storm with promotions through hugely popular games like Overwatch and Hearthstone and World of Warcraft. So as a result of that, I think these are 2 really interesting ways for organizations to come into Heroes of the Storm now and sort of grow along with the community and become the huge names within Heroes, even if they don't ever become S-tier esports organizations in other games. So I hope that answers the question. Unfortunately, that answer means we probably won't see teams like Cloud9, Immortals, Team Solo Mid, or see Na'Vi come back anytime soon, but it does mean that we can be on the lookout for brands and for names that are passionate about Heroes of the Storm coming into the community and becoming big parts of the community, like we've seen Roll20 and Heroes Hearth do. So if you've got a question that you'd like to get answered on Entry Level Esports, be sure to follow at TrollsGG on Twitter and myself at Trent_Esports. And we will next week and every week thereafter be releasing a tweet where you can leave your question as a reply. And that's how you'll get your question picked to answer on the show. Until next week, hope you all have a pleasant Christmas or holiday season, and we will see you next time.